So, you want to get into fantasy, but it's your fear genre because a lot of fantasy world building confuses you. But you want to get into romantasy because it's all the rage on TikTok, but you're worried about the politics side of fantasy, but you keep hearing people raving about Fourth Wing, and you really just want to immerse yourself in that. Does that sound like you? If that sounds like you have come to the right place. I am going to be going over some fantasy recommendations today for somebody who is new to the genre, and I am no expert in fantasy. I don't read a lot of high fantasy. I specifically am talking about romantasy, or fantasy with a strong subplot of romance. Because honestly, if there's not romance going on, I don't really care. So, this is for my romantasy girlies. If you really want to get into it, if you've been a romance reader and you want something different but like also the same, let me tell you what you're missing out on. Think of this as your comprehensive guide to romantasy and also just fantasy in general, because not all of these are like romantasy, but most of them are. Are you ready to have your life changed? Okay, let's begin. So, if you have never read any fantasy in your entire life and you really don't know anything about the genre, you don't know what to expect, I would recommend starting out with Harry Potter. Okay, and I know a lot of people read this when they're kids and it's kind of stupid to recommend Harry Potter because everybody knows Harry Potter, but you'd be surprised how many people have only watched the movies and have never actually read the books. I haven't even read all of the books. I read up to book 4. I'm currently reading the series. But I'm telling you, if you just read the first 2 to 3 books, it's a great introduction to a magical world that's really easy to understand and not too complicated. I think one of the biggest things with fantasy that people worry about is that all of the world building is going to be too complex and too confusing for them. So I think it's a good idea to start out with something like Harry Potter that's really easy to understand and that most people already kind of know the storyline too, just to like really become familiar with magical world building and all of that. I especially think if you read to the 3rd one or the 4th one, those are the ones that are really going to introduce you to like fantasy world building, because those are the ones where the story starts to get more complex. The first 2 are a little bit more like elementary, but then it really starts to get more complex in the 3rd and 4th one. So if you can stick it out until then, I think you should start with Harry Potter if you are like completely new to the genre. This is the only book, I'm pretty sure, of all of these books that are not romantasy, because I think most people who want to read romantasy start out as a romance reader, but you've probably never ventured into anything like world building, intense fantasy elements. So this is a good place to start if you haven't already read this. But if you are completely new, start here. Okay, so let's say you've read Harry Potter, maybe you've read some dystopian, which is a little bit similar to fantasy, but not exactly. But you read that when you were younger and you really want to get into adult fantasy or romantasy now, and it's been a while and you are still intimidated by the genre. I would recommend you read a YA romantasy like Once Upon a Broken Heart by Stephanie Garber. And this is a trilogy, so let me pick up the other 2 books. Starts with Once Upon a Broken Heart, then we have The Ballad of Never After, and then the last one actually just came out, so you don't have to wait for the last one to come out if you want to start this, but it's A Curse for True Love. And these books, I'm telling you, are a great place to start because they're so easy to understand. The world building is not intense, it is really easy to follow, and it makes sense. So if you are looking for something to start out with, this is a great series and I would recommend this to anybody. There's also like a YA romance element, so it's not super intense, but I think this is a good way to introduce the concept of fantasy with a subplot of romance to a new reader. This is the series that got me into like magical fantasy worlds, and I'm telling you, it's a gateway. It's a gateway to romantasy. So definitely check out this series. Stephanie Garber's writing is extremely quick, extremely clear, really easy to understand. And there's a map. So this is a good way to introduce you to maps, because a lot of fantasy books have maps. In this series, we follow Evangeline, and she is in a little bit of a pickle because the man that she loves is about to marry somebody else. And so she's very desperate to obviously stop the wedding. So she makes a deal with Jax, who is the Prince of Hearts, and he's also like a fate. So he is kind of dangerous, and a lot of people warn her against making a deal with him because it often ends in tragedy. But she does it anyway, and then she goes to the kingdom of the land to this ball called Noct Never Ending, I believe, and she's there almost in like a sort of like bachelor situation where the prince is trying to find his princess slash queen for when he becomes king. And so she ends up going to the ball, and then she runs into Jax there. She's just kind of wondering like when her deal is going to pan out and like when she's gonna have to pay the price for her deal with the Prince of Hearts. So a lot of stuff happens. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil anything, but the magic and the world and all of the like adventures that go on are top tier. And obviously I'm not gonna like explain what happens in these two because that would be like spoiling a lot of things, but I'm just asking you to trust me that these are really good. If you have like a vague knowledge of fantasy and dystopian, and if you were paying attention to like The Hunger Games and Divergent when you were younger, but you want to actually get into like fantasy now, I would start with something like this. And that was kind of the boat that I was in. So, okay, let's step it up just a little bit more. Now there's two routes that I would take from Once Upon a Broken Heart. And one of them is a little bit more fantasy and the other one is a little bit more romance. So we're going to start with the one that's a little bit more fantasy but still has a subplot of romance. And that is this series, which is called Twin Crowns, and the second one is Cursed Crowns. And I'm pretty sure there's going to be a third one called Burning Crowns. So this is, I think, going to be a trilogy. This is another YA romantasy, but like I said, this is a little bit heavier on the fantasy elements. I really enjoyed this. I feel like this is like a step above Once Upon a Broken Heart in terms of like complexity and like world building, but it's still really easy to understand. And I also really like the dual perspective going on in this book. It's a dual plot line, so there's two perspectives that switch back and forth throughout both of the books. And I think that's important because a lot of times that happens during romantasy books. So the dual plot lines here that are going on, I think, are a great way to prepare yourself for some of the more intense romantasy that I'm gonna get to. In these two books, we follow twins. One of them is a princess and the other one grew up in this like remote area, and she's a witch. The witches have kind of been banished from the land because of their power. The humans were getting basically like intimidated by them. But there's still a small community which one of the twins lives with, and the other twin is kind of ignorant about the witches and kind of thinks that the witches are bad and she's the one that's the princess. They end up switching places. So the one that has grown up with the witches has pledged her life to basically going to the palace and becoming the queen by taking over for her sister, like kidnapping her sister and being like going in her place to be queen so that the witches can live free and not in fear anymore. And so we kind of follow both of their journeys as they kind of switch places and are exposed to different elements of the world that they'd never been to before. And there's also romance for both of them, which is like top tier. I'm just saying, like the romance is absolutely adorable in these. So I definitely think that I liked the first one better, but they were both really good and I'm really looking forward to the third one. Yeah, this is a great series to read after Once Upon a Broken Heart. A little bit more complex in terms of the world building and the politics of it, but still really entertaining. The romance, chef's kiss. It is YA, it's not adult romance, just so you know. but I think that this is a great stepping stone to where we're going, and you'll see where we're going. Okay, I told you that there were 2 different routes you could take from Once Upon a Broken Heart, and Twin Crowns is like the more fantasy side, and then this is the more romance heavy subplot of fantasy vibe. So Divine Rivals is heavily romance, but there is a tiny subplot of fantasy going on, and it's almost like a historical romantasy, which is really interesting. In this book, we follow 2 reporters at a newspaper who are rivals. The main female character, her brother has gone off to fight in the war of these 2 gods, and she hasn't heard from him in a while, so she begins writing him letters, and then she realizes that somebody is replying to her, and at first she's like, is it my brother? But then she realizes that it's actually the rival that she works with. So it's a romance, it's giving historical fantasy, because when I was reading this, I was picturing like 1920s London. That's the vibes that it was giving, but it also has fantasy elements, and it also talks a little bit about like being a war reporter, and there are like elements of action that go on that are really interesting, and the cliffhanger is like next level. So I think this book is perfect for somebody who has been a romance reader and wants to get into fantasy. The only reason I put this after Once Upon a Broken Heart is because I think some of the fantastical elements are a little confusing if you don't have like a YA knowledge, and this is technically YA, but like in my opinion I would say it's not YA, not because of like anything that happens, but like just the vibes are giving like adults. But I feel like Once Upon a Broken Heart is a lot more just like simple, and it's a really quick story, whereas this is more like emotionally complex, and the magic is a little bit more like sophisticated, I guess. Like I said, if you have been like specifically like a romance reader and you want to get into fantasy, this is a great place to go. This is a great option. And also I rated this book 5 stars. Like, it is amazing, one of my favorite books of the year. So just recommend this to anybody. I will say that the fantasy is not the main thing. I feel like the romance is definitely the main thing in this, but the sequel is coming out next month, so if you want to read this, now is the perfect chance. And I'm just assuming that in the sequel, because it's a duology, the fantasy might be a little bit more intense, so that could be a good thing, because you can start out with this, which isn't super intense fantasy wise, and then go to Ruthless Vows, which is the next one that's coming out next month, and it might be a little bit more fantasy focused. So now we're getting into more of the like intense fantasy romance books that are like out there and popular, and that a lot of people love, but also a lot of people are intimidated by because of the fantasy elements. I'm gonna go from what I think is the least intimidating to the most intimidating based on my own experience. We'll start with Powerless by Lauren Roberts. This book is amazing, an amazing romantasy. I would say it's definitely more complex than the other ones that I have talked about, but the characters and the way that they describe what's going on and the writing makes it easy to follow, in my opinion. This is also like a dual perspective, so it goes back and forth between the 2 main characters. The romance is like really intense. There's a lot of tension. It is like top-notch slow burn. Like, it hits different. And I always say that slow burn and fantasy hits different. I mean, romance and fantasy hits different anyways, just in general, because the stakes are so much higher. Like, they could die at any moment or whatever's going on in the plot line. That's why I love romantasy so much, because the romance feels more intense and like life or death. And this is giving that. It is giving that and more. The writing is just like really good. It's really easy to follow, but still a little bit complex. Like, you do have to think about it. You do have to like picture things. And also the writer is like around my age, so always support young writers. And she has documented her writing journey on TikTok for this book. So obviously support her in any way we can. But truly, this is like one of the best romantasies I've ever read. I would honestly classify this as YA because there's nothing like adult that happens in it, but the romance is like I was on the edge of my seat. The tension was unbearable, and I just love that. I love when I'm like physically in pain. Basically, in this book, it's about this world where there's the elites and there's the ordinaries. And the elites have like special powers, that's why they're elite. And ordinaries have no powers and they're killed off. And our main character, Peyton, is an ordinary, but she is pretending to be an elite. And the main male character, whose name is Kai, is a prince. So he is an elite and he is the son of the king. Peyton and Kai get called to participate in these trials of the elites, but Peyton is an ordinary, obviously, so she's like trying to figure out how she's going to survive these trials because she's an ordinary. It's just, if any of that sounds, it's kind of giving like Hunger Games, but like more fantasy vibes. If any of that sounds amazing to you, I really think you would love this book. You've read Powerless, you feel ready to go on to something maybe even more intense, and you are excited because of all of the hype surrounding this book. So now you want to try out Fourth Wing. I would say after Powerless, you are probably ready to read Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. This series, Fourth Wing, Iron Flame, it's called The Empyrean, but there's currently only 2 books out. It's going to be a 5-book series. 2 of them are currently out. Iron Flame, which is the second one, just came out like literally a couple weeks ago. I will say, do not start reading this if you are going to be like really upset that the 3rd book is not going to come out for a while, because the author has said that she has not even started writing the 3rd one yet. So it's going to be a while before we get the 3rd installment. But the first 2 are amazing. And I know a lot of people will hate on this series, but overall as a romantasy series, like this is god tier in my opinion. I always describe Fourth Wing as like Divergent in the Hunger Games vibes, with dragons, that takes place at Hogwarts. So if that sounds interesting to you, like, you need to read this book. But basically, we follow Violet, who is the daughter of the general of the War College that she is about to enter. And in the War College, there's quadrants. There's the Scribe Quadrant, the Infantry Quadrant, the Healer Quadrant, and the Writer's Quadrant. Violet has been trained by her father her whole life to be a scribe. When it comes time for her to go into a quadrant, her mother tells her, "You're going to be a writer because I'm a writer, and all of your siblings are writers." So she is thrown into the Writer's Quadrant against her will, and it's basically like, can she survive? She faces like a series of like challenges to pass her first year, and then she has to make it to threshing, which is the ceremony where she either bonds a dragon or doesn't, and basically writers get all of their power from a bond with a dragon, and then they develop a signet, which is like a power. And so basically all of this is so that they will be trained to be writers to fight for Navarre, which is the country. But there's another country on the continent called Paromial, and they share a border, and they're constantly at war, and they have been for like hundreds of years. So they're basically training to be writers to fight in the war. And on her first day, when she is joining the quadrant, she runs into this guy named Xaden Ryerson. It is like a strong enemies to lovers romance, and it is chef's kiss. Pretty much like all that I can tell you without giving anything away is that the plot twists at the end of these books are literally crazy. The fantasy elements are kind of complex compared to all the other books that I've talked about so far. There's a lot of world building, there's a lot of like things that you have to understand about the world and dragons and magic. So in that arena, it's a little bit more complex, but the romance is very good. I think once you've started with all these other books, this will not be super intimidating. I was really intimidated to read this and I ate it up. So I think you just really need to jump into this, but I would definitely recommend starting with something like YA romantasy before going into this. This is definitely adult fantasy. This is not YA, this is adult romantasy. So just keep that in mind. But it is top tier. Top tier. We have come to the end of the video, and I think most of you can probably guess what I'm gonna recommend as like the ultimate fantasy slash romantasy. I have not read Throne of Glass yet, so I'm not gonna recommend that because I haven't read it myself. But a lot of people also recommend that along with this series, obviously. So if that interests you, I've heard that that's more fantasy than romance. But this series, A Court of Thorns and Roses, also known as ACOTAR, is very much romantasy. And I'm telling you, like some people, I don't know, I think some people struggle with the world building of this, understanding what fae are, and even just like knowing that this book is about fae and fairies, I think intimidates people. But I'm telling you, you really don't need to know anything about fae to read this series. Like I didn't even know what a fae was. I googled it. It's literally just like a fairy, like, but it's not like a rainbow fairy like Barbie Bibble, whatever. It's just like a fantasy creature. Like they look like humans, they have like kind of like elf ears, but you can look up pictures if that will help you visualize, but really it's nothing like too complex that you can't understand. And I'm telling you, once you get past this book, I would say like once you get like 75% through this book, you are ballin'. Like that's when stuff really starts to get intense and really good. I will say like the first book is not the best one. Like I still gave it 5 stars because as I was reading it, I really liked it. But looking back, it's not as good as this at all. Like this is like a 6-star read for me. So if you can get past this, a lot of people think that this one's a little bit too drawn out and a little bit slower of a pace until about like 75%. If you can make it through this, you'll be rewarded with this. This is top tier, god tier romantasy, and I'm telling you, like if you have been waiting to read this series but like you don't know if you'd be able to like understand it, or it's kind of like your fear series, this was my fear series because everyone is obsessed with it. I'm telling you, just read it, just start it. Like that's literally what I did. I had no idea what this was about. I had no idea what a fairy was, and here I am raving about it. I'm literally obsessed with it, and I'm about to start the 3rd one soon. You just need to read this series. Just start it. I'm telling you, like it seems intimidating, but it's really good. Like once you get into it, you can't stop. It's addicting. So yeah, I'm gonna end the video off with this series because I just think it's the quintessential romantasy series that's out there right now. Everybody loves it. It is like top tier. It is more complex. It is more, there's a lot more world building. There's a lot more to understand about the creatures and how they work. If you can conquer your fear by like starting out with like a easier, less complex story and work your way up to like ACOTAR, like it is life-changing. I'm telling you, once you go romantasy, you never go back. I haven't read a romance book in so long because it doesn't do it for me anymore. All I have to say is that if there is a man that wields shadows, I'll be reading that, and I'll be loving it, and I'll be buying merch. So that is all that I have for this guide to fantasy for the holiday season. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and let me know what you think in the comments, or if you have any other recommendations for somebody who is new to fantasy, or if there's anything that I missed that you want to add, feel free to do so. Hopefully this inspires you to get into fantasy because I'm telling you, it is life-changing. It's the perfect time of year to read romantasy. So yeah, that's all for my guide to romantasy / fantasy. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will talk to you in my next video.